Good afternoon, everyone. I know we're reaching that deadly post-lunch slump hour. We'll try to keep everyone awake as we talk about learning and not learning in the United States. And I will see how good my skills in technology are if I can get this to work. Hey, I feel really good.
Problem solved.
Problem solved, okay. And by the way, I've given it an acronym because in education we love acronyms, right? So PSTRE, I call it poster. If you don't like that, you can come up with another one, but I like poster. Okay. So by way of overview, I'd like to give you a little bit of context for the PIAAC findings that Usha and I came up with from the survey. And we'll talk a little bit about the key findings and implications of the findings for policy and practice and recommendations for future research. Okay. By way of context, this particular slide is not about PIAAC, but I think it gives us a little bit of the sense of the so what. Why are we talking about adult transitions to learning in the United States? What this graphic represents, and it looks green on my screen, but probably not on yours, but this is the shortfall that many states, in fact there are 30-some states up there, experience as a result of not having enough high school students coming out of high school and going into college. So because that's not happening, because we have population changes in our country, what we're seeing is that ultimately by 2020 there would be a shortfall in each of these states. If you look on the far left, you're looking at Texas, California, and Florida. To start with, hundreds of thousands of folks that we just don't have enough there to fill the jobs that are needed, the high skill level jobs, because people have not gotten the advanced education. I think that's very, very important to acknowledge that the only way we're going to get there is if we have folks who are adults that are participating in education somehow. So I wanted to start with that as context. Moving on from there, I think a lot of us were aware when we saw the report last year, Time for the U.S. to Reskill, question mark, that the skill levels for the United States in literacy, numeracy, and poster are substantially lower than they are compared with the international average. And in fact, the U.S. average is about level 2. And as I think Johan referred to very early this morning, he talked about the large number of U.S. adults that have very low skills below level 2. And he didn't note this, but he has in other sessions that there were 3 million people with low skills who would have liked to participate in adult education and training but didn't. I think those numbers are very important. A little bit of further context getting into the study now. We defined learners as adults who participated in either formal or non-formal learning in the 12 months before PIAAC assessment. If they did not participate in either formal or non-formal learning, we called them non-learners. Now that doesn't mean that they're not learning informally perhaps, but that was not tracked as such in the data set. So please bear with our terminology as we talk about learners and non-learners. That's how we've defined them. And we further classified adults into 3 categories based on their highest educational attainment level. Less than high school, and if you read in the paper it'll tell you which exact ISED levels that's referring to, high school level and post-secondary education level. One other finding, one new finding I should say, that I would like to point out is that an estimated 80 million less than high school and high school level adults are in the pool for formal education. I think that's a tremendous opportunity that we have in this country that we all need to be aware of. A large portion of those are what we classified as non-learners, and an additional proportion of those pursue non-formal learning, but they never, or have not at least recently, got to formal learning. Okay, so what do the adult learners and non-learners look like in terms of the breakout? If you look at the darker, oh, yours is purple. Okay. All right, if you look at the darker purple beginning at the top and working your way around to the right, you can see the less than high school learners, followed by the high school learners, and then that largest block kind of at the bottom represents the post-secondary education learners. So those are the folks that are learning that already have a post-secondary degree. And then the non-learner proportions follow after that in the lighter purple color accordingly. Okay, this is probably way too small for the folks in the back of the room to read, so I encourage you to take a look at the PowerPoint, or even better yet the paper, when those are made available, and I understand that they will be posted sometime in the near future. A few demographic pieces of information about learners and non-learners that we would like to pass along. One of the things that we noticed when we looked regionally in the United States is that there tended to be higher proportions of learners in the Northeast and the Midwest, and higher proportions of non-learners in the South and the West portions of the country. And again, I realize you can't read the numbers, but I'll just give you a little bit of the information here as we go. Another very interesting demographic feature is, of course, age, and we were talking about that just before we had lunch. So what we're seeing is that the learners at their various levels tend to have a much lower median age than the non-learners. So the median age for the non-learners was 45 to 49 years old. That was a bit of a surprise to me. I don't know if it is to you all, but it definitely surprised us when we first looked at that. We also tend to see high proportions of low-income folks at the less than high school and the high school level. No surprise there, most likely, because that's been found in previous studies related to these international data sets. At the bottom, the last three rows talk about people with difficulties seeing or difficulties hearing or with learning disabilities. And one of the things that kind of jumped out at us in this study when we looked at that was that the proportion of those things was much higher in non-learners than in learners. So I think that's telling as well. Okay. We also took a look in this paper at skill levels. So we looked at literacy, numeracy, and poster. So the blue line that you see here represents literacy, and we've divided it into two graphics, learners and non-learners, and I tried to lay these side by side so that you could, even if you can't see the numbers from here, you can at least see the lines. And you can see that even at the less than high school level, it starts a little bit higher for the learners than it does for the non-learners. And then the range goes up as you go through the high school learners and the post-secondary learners. But when you look at the non-learners, regardless of their educational attainment, it doesn't get quite as high. All of those differences are significant between groups and between categories as well. In terms of poster skills, this one's laid out a little bit differently. Now we have the less than high school, the high school, and the PIAAC along the bottom of the graph. And what we're looking at the top is the green line represents the learners, and the blue line represents the non-learners. The other thing I'd like to point out about this is you see that the range is fairly restricted between level 1 and just barely getting to level 2 there. And I think that goes back to the point Steve was just making a few moments ago about whether folks were included or not in relationship to digital literacy and poster. Okay, so we also talked in the paper about the types of adult learning. So this is the folks that we classified as learners. About 2/3 of them participated in non-formal education of some kind. There was approximately 11% that participated only in formal learning, and then the remainder participated in both. Moving on from there, another table that's difficult to see, but a few points that I'll highlight is that most of the folks that we looked at were in fact employed. A few differences. Non-learners tended to be more on permanent disability status than learners were. They also tended to be something that they called NEET, which stands for not employed, not in education or training. That also was a much higher proportion for non-learners than it was for learners. I think the last thing that I wanted to point out from that set of data in the table is that the vast majority of both learners and non-learners were quite satisfied with their jobs. It exceeded 75% in just about every category. However, there was quite a bit more tendency for the non-learners to stay at their same job. They had less mobility than the learners did. So I think that was an important finding to point out as well. Okay. So how did they learn? What were the methods of learning for non-formal opportunities? We didn't look at more of the specifics for formal, but we did look at some specifics for non-formal learning. The most prevalent one was on-the-job training. Okay, so what you're looking at here, the blue bars, or purple, depending on what you're looking at, represent the less than high school group. The green bars represent the high school group. On-the-job training, or OJT, was the most prevalent type of learning that they pursued. That was followed by seminars and workshops. There was a question related to that on the background questionnaire. And then comes distance learning, or DL. And then the last category was private lessons. And you can see that the percentages drop off pretty sharply in terms of who's participating in those different types of learning. And I think it's very telling that with the distance learning percentages particularly being so low, it makes me wonder what relationship does that have to those relatively low poster skills that we were seeing. That's not something that we pursued in this paper, but it's definitely a question that came up as we interpreted the results. And the last major finding that I would like to share today has to do with employer support for either formal or non-formal learning. So if you look at the blue bars on this chart, and again, I realize you probably can't see all of the numbers, but if you just look at the colors, the blue bars represent full or partial employer support. So what we're seeing here is that employers tend to support those who already have the post-secondary degrees to get additional training or education. And it's particularly noticeable in the top set of bars, which represents the formal, but it's also noticeable in the non-formal. Those folks that have less than a high school education already get the least employer support. So we've got a little bit of what they call a Matthew effect going on here, where the rich get richer and the poor stay very poor. And I don't mean to say that in any disrespectful way whatsoever. It just is very noticeable in these data in terms of the support that employers are providing for their employees. Okay. So let's move on to implications. We noted in our paper a number of implications for policymakers, for adult and continuing education, and for employers. First of all, for policymakers, it looks like there's a lot of opportunity out there to review policies on formal and non-formal learning that could impact particularly non-traditional adult learners who are so needed. Going back to that very first slide that I showed you, we definitely have the need there. So if we're looking at adults with low income, men who perhaps have become disengaged in learning, adults with learning disabilities or physical disabilities for that matter. One of the needs that again, I'm in the same boat as everybody else. It was a large paper and very short number of slides. So I'm kind of leaping here, but one of the things that we talked about in the paper is definitely the cost issue. As you just saw in the previous slide on employer support, if they're not being supported by their employer to go to further educational opportunities, then they have to come up with the funds themselves. And if you're talking about a population that's primarily low income, probably the money isn't there. And so there's an opportunity, I think, for policymakers to consider how can we get funding for part-time adult learners to continue learning? How can that happen? Particularly if there are issues associated with disabilities. I think it's ultimately important for incentives to be available to employers to help in that process, and for policies to be developed that support small businesses to provide workplace training or even educational benefits for external education. We also have several recommendations for adult and continuing education. I realize I'm getting kind of low on my time, so I will be a little bit selective in talking about some of these, but I do encourage you to read them in the full paper when you have a chance. So we're suggesting that adult and continuing education could collaborate with employers to the extent possible to help folks have access to instruction during work hours, to get tuition costs covered. We're also suggesting there's a connection there of employee mobility and learning, and so how could that be taken advantage of in terms of employers being able to provide training for new employees, or perhaps for transitioning employees as well. And then let's go ahead and move on to the last set of implications, and those are for workplaces. So one of the concerns related to the workplace is simply that learning needs to be accessible for adults at all levels, so employees at all levels, not just those that have the college degrees already, but those that do not have the high school degree, or those that did graduate from high school and may have stopped their learning experiences, even temporarily. So a couple of ways that could happen would be for employers to find ways to provide release time so that employees could get involved in learning. Perhaps to establish employer-employee task forces that could tackle some of the barriers that come up that employees face, and also to encourage some of these more experienced and well-trained post-secondary level folks to mentor and coach some of the less established or folks with less education to gain learning and greater engagement in the workplace. Okay. A few recommendations for future research, and then I'll conclude. We think that it's important to continue looking at these relationships of learning and skills. They're in lots of different ways. I don't have time to go into all the details at this point, but particularly I think that connection with distance learning would be worth looking at. I personally think it's important to know even more about the non-learners, what's going on with them, and to understand what might be happening to them, and how we can retain them once we actually get them to come back to learning. And then finally, we have recommendations related to formal and non-formal learning. And we encourage you to look at those in the full paper. I realize my time is up, and so I thank everyone for listening, and I'll look forward to your questions.